Episode 14, Pumpkins and Squash. What's the difference? Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the pumpkin and its identity, or not, as a squash. As the first hardcore identity politics food in America, this will be your look into the early life of the political pumpkin. So pull up to your place at the table, and let's dig in. The thing that caught me by surprise when I opened up my research on pumpkins was how strong people's feelings about this fruit have always been. I guess I shouldn't have been that surprised. I did grow up on the annual watching of Charlie Brown and the Great Pumpkin and the Thanksgiving special that contains the Peppermint Patty rant that ends with her lament for the missing pumpkin pie. It was clear from early on that the pumpkin was an important cultural object. But how early it started and the way it started did take me aback. Unlike most of what we will cover in the 17th century, the pumpkin is truly a New World American colonial invention. Every other food either seems to start with its European, African, Native American, or Asian identity, and then has its edges sanded to fit it into the emerging United States of America identity. The pumpkin, on the other hand, as a standalone category in its shiny, bulbous orange presence, was invented by the British colonists. And I think this holds the key to why our modern relationship with the pumpkin is so bizarre. 21st century America's infatuation seems to be with the apparent platonic ideal of the pumpkin, but not the fruit itself. So where did it start? I fell back on my old comfortable points of inquiry. Biology student me and cook me have both had some serious questions over time. First, why is that truckload of variety in color, shape, and texture, summer squashes and winter squashes, all tucked together under squash? Yet pumpkin, which from everything I can tell is clearly just another squash, gets a whole category carved out for it. Pun intended, I think. And second, while writing my vegetable cookbook, I went through a whole period of trying to figure out what was up with the absolute dearth of recipes for pumpkin that were not pie. This situation has changed somewhat since 2010, but not really. Americans seem to love the idea of pumpkin, as evinced by the rise in pumpkin spice products and the oceans of more and less realistic plastic pumpkin decor. But pumpkin spice products and the decorations contain no actual pumpkins. It appears that Americans are less enthralled by real, actual, live pumpkins. They're more a symbol than a food. As we move forward through time, I'll get more into the different stages of pumpkin development. But for now, we need to look at the roots. First, the name. The English word squash is derived from words in several Algonquin dialects that mean approximately a green thing eaten raw. The earliest written version of this is the Narragansett word askutasquash, as written down by premier Rhode Islander Roger Williams in 1643. And squash would be the word all the fruits of this plant, summer and winter, large and small, green, blue-gray, yellow, and orange, would all get called to begin with. The word pumpkin, on the other hand, is a word that came from Europe with the English colonists. It was derived from the French term pompion, which itself comes from the Latin pipo, which meant roughly cooked by the sun. In Europe, from Italy and spreading north, the thing all of these people were referring to with pipo and pompion were melons and perhaps cucumber-type things that had grown over large. Even back then, it was not a compliment to have one's name connected to pipos. The Roman satirist Seneca, whose name would much later be the brand of applesauce I grew up eating, and even now is part of the Libby's pumpkin puree supply chain, and that is a few tales for later. Anyway, Seneca, way back in the 1st century CE, would call the Emperor Claudius the Latin equivalent of pumpkinhead, or maybe melonhead. Whichever, he did not mean it as a gratifying compliment. And while we are tracing the journey of the word that would become pumpkin in the New World, I'm pretty sure I am not allowed to have a serious discussion that includes pumpkins and England without including a reference to Falstaff. In The Merry Wives of Windsor, the epitome of Falstaff's bloated shape and bubble-headed self-regard are emphasized as he is called a gross, watery pompion. Shakespeare was doing his part to mix English culture with the New World. After all, it is generally accepted that the inspiration for The Tempest came from a friend's complaints about a terrible voyage to Bermuda. With Falstaff, Shakespeare made sure everyone knew how to properly employ the word pompion. So the early British colonists coming to the New World were reasonably familiar with large fruits called pompions, though upon departure from Europe, they would have had in mind melons. As literate people, some were even in the printing trade, they would have likely had a chance to look at some of the earliest 16th century drawings and engravings of both northern coastal and Caribbean island villages in the New World. These show idealized noble savages, tall and muscular, posed like Greek statues, decked in feathers and furs, displaying the plenty of the land with a range of squash at their feet. And those squash, as prolific growers in a range of farm climates, made it back in a hurry to the Old World, right alongside corn, tomatoes, and peanuts. Squash would end up in 16th century Dutch paintings as both a representation of agricultural bounty and suggestions of the voluptuous licentiousness of peasant women. And Italians were already eating squash blossoms by the end of the 16th century, as they appeared in still life paintings alongside other foods. But back in its New World home, instead of being an allegory or a painter's exercise, squash was more at home as part of the companion planting trio of corn, beans, and squash. We now generally know this arrangement as the Three Sisters. But large squash would also sometimes have their own field as the vines of the larger varieties spread and produced hundreds of pounds of fruit. The tribes that were teaching the colonists what to grow and eat would consume the flowers, the tender vine tips, and the fruits all along its growing season. The thin-skinned summer squash, when they were small, tender, and sweet, would be called vine apples by the colonists. They were typically judged to be refreshing, but not so pleasant as pears and apples from back home. At the end of the growing season, the large, sun-ripened, waxy, hard-shelled winter squash, these would be kept whole for later consumption or cut into wedges that were dried. The wedges would later be eaten as sort of a travel jerky or stirred back into long, simmering stews to rehydrate. There are also notes of large squash being used as cooking vessels themselves, but the colonists seeking to hold on to their sense of civilization would continue to prefer their iron pots, and later on, fancy silver soup tureens and other ostentatious serving dishes. Regardless, squash was a food that had a place on the table and in the pot for over half the year. And speaking of tables, back at that late fall harvest feast in 1621, despite later branding, the Puritans did not consider it a Thanksgiving, and there was no pumpkin pie. I can say with certainty that there was nothing we would recognize as pumpkin pie because of the utter lack of milk and sugar, as well as a complete absence of wheat to make a proper paste or crust. At this point, there were no cows or wheat, only corn and barley. The few notes that were made and survived regarding this shared meal make prominent mention of meat, specifically birds and venison, but no particular mention is made of the vegetables. When William Bradford lists the crops grown in early Plymouth, he mentions melons, which at that point was an interchangeable name with pompion, so could have meant either European melon, cucumber, or American squash. We literally cannot know. As for the Thanksgiving label, the separatists were very particular about what different celebrations were named and what activities took place at them. As part of their rejection of Catholic Christianity and what they saw as the weak tea rejection by the Church of England, what with the kings simply taking the place of the Pope, they did things like ostentatiously not eating fish on Fridays. To those rather dogmatic religious refugees, a Thanksgiving was a prayerful celebration typically associated with fasting and deprivations as a way to honor the role of the divine in whatever they were giving thanks for: a victory, a safe arrival, a recovery from tragedy. Feasting, on the other hand, would be a fête, a purposeful appreciation of plenty. Over time, the Pilgrims would struggle to balance out a feast celebrating harvest plenty while keeping it separate from older pagan practices and avoiding the sin of gluttony. Eventually, some version of church in the morning, followed by a family feast, would become the norm. Often fasting until the large meal would be emphasized, and the feast would highlight family reunification by bringing together multiple generations and different family branches. Thus, food was removed from the center of attention, and an acceptable middle way was created. Because the growing season was typically a chancier thing in the north, and the harvest period was shorter and more intense, fall harvest festivals in general tended to be more of a concentrated feature event in the northern colonies than they ever were in the southern ones. Okay, fine. If the first Thanksgiving wasn't a Thanksgiving, and there was no pumpkin pie, how did squash, and particularly the large orange one, get attached to the word pumpkin? Once the colonists got their feet under them, started proper farms, and imported real livestock, they could not deny the usefulness of the profligate growing habit of the large winter squash. Just one plant, even one growing as a volunteer in a dung pile, could produce a bumper crop. But here's the thing. They were big, they were showy, especially the ones that were all orange, and they even stored pretty well. What with that hard, waxy shell, but they weren't really that tasty. They were sort of watery and bland, and unlike the smaller, denser squashes, the really large ones were mainly a big, hollow void. So you have a round, voluptuous shape that is mainly full of nothing but many, many, many seeds, grows in a fairly wild and uncontrolled manner, requiring a very little effort on the part of the farmer. But it isn't that great a food, unless you're really starving. And to top it off, it's showy, possibly even a gaudy color. Well, you have something right there that the Puritans, who loved their allegories, made much of. In fact, that was the way pumpkin and squash started to acquire their very separate identities in the colonial kitchen. Squash was food, cooked by sensible people in sensible ways. It was incorporated into the seasonal food rotation of imported European foodways. Squash occupied a spot alongside beans and corn. Those were not exactly the same as peas, barley, wheat, and rye, but served similarly. Squash filled in holes left by green melons, apples, and other vegetable foods that filled up the corners and bulked out meat sauces and stews. But the large, garish pumpkin was wild and unruly, fibrous and watery. So it was preferable to keep the grain, apples, and sensible squashes for the house, where they went into stews and sauces for meats. These ridiculous, hollow, prolific, stringy fruits would supplement the winter feed for the newly arrived pigs and cows. And that color. In Northern Europe, orange was barely recognized as a color at all in the 17th century. There was red and yellow and this thing called yellow-red, as well as the particular category of gold. Gold and its partner in hedonistic spending, the spice saffron, were both derided by the Pilgrims. It wasn't until William III of the House of Orange was invited to England to clean house in 1689 after all those messy Jameses. Not until then did most people in England even get their head around this new color. Yes, oranges, naranja, were a thing in Europe at this point, but only if you were ludicrously wealthy or just hung about in the Spanish court. Back in the colonies, where there were no rich men of fashion, there was no orange, but there was ridicule. So these enormous, bright, lazy man's fruits that were only eaten when the other food ran out, they became the fool's gold of the day, The Pompeian label, which morphed over time into the word pumpkin, seemed perfect for these things that were flash, yet watery. They gave an appearance of plenty and substance, but were really the fare of the poor. One could survive on them, but not thrive. Really, they were the epitome of the phrase, pretty is as pretty does. It was just poor filler. It was used as the cheapest thing to make the cheapest versions of things. The pulp of the untasty pumpkin would make or bulk out a stew, just not as well as the tastier, richer, creamier squashes. It could be used to extend cornmeal to make pumpkin bread, and not the sweet spiced fall cake we enjoy with cream cheese. Rather, this was a grainy, pulpy substance that would cause travelers to search for a different tavern. Pumpkins would be crushed and juiced like apples or other fruit, and the liquid cooked down to make a sort of sweetener. This sweetish liquid could also have yeast added to make it a poor pumpkin beer. But this was a last resort. Real beer was made with grain. Barley was preferred. But pumpkin beer was preferable to water, which was mainly a drink for sinners, ascetics, and fools. Europeans as a whole were rightly suspicious of water. Just about anywhere large numbers of people congregated, they used the rivers, streams, lakes, ponds as wash basins and sewers. Dirt and sweat were understood as signs of travel and toil and washed off for the sake of civility, but worrying that your well was near fields where you applied animal manure or in proximity of the garderobe or other facilities for relief and chamber pot emptying wasn't really thought about deeply. Thus it became one of those things everyone knew. The only plain water safe to drink came from springs. I have long walked around with the idea in my head that the main healing powers of many of those sacred springs, Christian and pagan alike, had more to do with the combination that people were simply able to drink or bathe in water that was free from parasites, and they stopped consuming liquids made safe for consumption with that dash of alcohol for a change. While some cultures figured out that boiling water made it safe, among these were the early coffee and tea drinking cultures, Europe leaned into mildly alcoholic drinks as its solution instead. And that is what the pumpkin beer, and as we go along, other beers were partly about. There's more to beer than safe to drink, but we'll cover that in depth later. These beers were not the relax in front of the game 5% alcohol, or even the Prohibition Compromise beer of 3.2% alcohol. Nope, this was small beer, usually under 1% alcohol, that was an important source of liquid and some carbohydrates. The alcohol content had more to do with making sure it didn't smell suspicious if kept in a wooden barrel for a few weeks. For barrels, bladders, and other organic containers were the way most liquid was stored. Keep plain water in a wooden bucket for any amount of time, and it starts to gain an off smell and a bit of visible wildlife. Gently fermented liquids have a pleasant, sweetish, yeasty smell and fend off the growth of beasties and suspicious green scum. Pumpkin beer wasn't real good beer, but it was better than water, and depending on where you were, nothing was sometimes better than water. And then there was the shape, the largeness, the wildness of the vine. The full, round pumpkins were a bit suggestive and voluptuous. The vines had these curly tendrils, a bit like the hair escaping from a woman's cap. And they wrapped around other things and clung to them. For the straight-laced pilgrims, all this sensuality and growth and the large pumpkins full of thousands of seeds, well, the fecundity could be a bit embarrassing. And the fact that any variety of squash could cross-pollinate with any other type of squash, you could never definitely depend on them to breed true one year from the next. The word promiscuous could also be used. All added into the fact that they'd just grow with so little effort. In the 17th century, that really went against the grain. The carefully husbanded and controlled small squashes, while pushing up on the edges of civilization, the pumpkin grew right over the line, climbed up over the fence, and left the yard. Pumpkins were almost tailor-made to madden the Puritans, and thus they became a symbol for laziness, stupidity, being a spendthrift or a beggar that had to make do with the least. They were a stand-in for symbolizing loose women, or women who might be either lazy or have a tendency to run away. As a result, squash would be in the house and maybe even make it to market. Pumpkins would stay in the barn, feed the livestock, and like peanuts, also be raised as food for the enslaved. In the 17th century, squash were sensible, but there was no joy in pumpkins, only degradation, laziness, and a possible dangerous wildness. The 18th century will only be a bit better for the pumpkin, so we'll have to wait until the 19th century until pumpkin gets a better agent and an image change. After the flash and controversy of the pumpkin, we have one more unglamorous round in the storage cellar to go, this time with root vegetables. So you get to find out just what the 17th century colonists were eating before they had access to the potato. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also on the show's Twitter bio at THOA Food and in the show description.